Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that has been on my TBR for this year, and I'm finally glad that I got to it. It is a book about messiahs and Jesus. I am referring to The Last Temptation of Christ by Nikos Kazantzakis, which was published around 1955, and then in 1960 it was translated into English. For those who don't know, Nikos Kazantzakis is a Greek writer, or was a Greek writer, who lived between the late 1800s and the mid 1900s. What's interesting is some of his work was published after his death and translated after he died. So some of his work didn't get out to outside of Greece until after he died, which is a bit unfortunate. He's known for writing, The Last Temptation of Christ, but also Zorba the Greek, and many other books and short stories and whatnot. A lot of his work has to do with religion, mythology, and also the state of Greece around the time of World War II, as Greece had only become its own thing, around that time. It was only like a sort of democracy, having left the sort of rule of a king fairly recently in Nikos's own life. And all of that stuff kind of shows up in his writing, and he was a bit controversial for it. Not only in this book because of the themes of religion and Jesus that shows up, but also talking about Greece and the state of religion in Greece and just the state of things in general. It certainly did not make him a lot of fans at the time. But a lot of people have reflected on his writings and noted how good in quality they were, and how the things he was saying were things that needed to be said. So that is very fascinating. And critics have largely regarded his work pretty well. So I think with time he's become more appreciated. I actually did not know about Nikos until I stumbled across this book, so I'm very happy to have found it, and I can't wait to talk about it. So without further ado, let's talk about The Last Temptation of Christ. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So The Last Temptation of Christ, of course, focuses on Jesus of Nazareth. At the start of the story, he's very bitter, frustrated, and deeply sad. He's been hearing voices, and he sort of has this blasphemous belief that he might be the Messiah of some sorts, but he doesn't tell anyone because that's really hard to say, and his friends and family don't really know what to make of him. He even has a dream at the beginning where he kind of foresees his own death, noting that people are going to try to kill him because of his connection to God. And one of those people is the Redbeard, which is Judas. He confronts Jesus and asks why he is building crucifixes for the Romans to crucify the rebellion leaders who are trying to get the Roman Empire out of Jerusalem and Israel at large. Jesus doesn't really have a good answer, and this upsets Judas, but Judas stops short of killing him because he feels like there's something bigger to Jesus, and he wants to figure out what that is. And a short while later, he has a conversation with Mary Magdalene. They were betrothed at one point, but she's upset because he seems to be, she tells him that he's using God as a sort of crutch. He's hiding behind God because he's too much of a coward, and he's too sad to really deal with any of the things that are going on. And they could have had a beautiful relationship, but Jesus is a coward, is what she's getting at. And Jesus doesn't really have a good response to this, and it it only shows like the sort of rifts that are growing between Jesus and his friends at this point in his life. Jesus later flees to a monastery where he confesses his sins, noting that he believes these blasphemous things, and his uncle Rabbi Simeon tells him, to indulge in these beliefs, that if it helps him, he should go preach the word of God, and that would probably help a great many people. And he ends up saving Mary from a stoning and gaining a number of followers because of his initial preaching. And one of these people is Judas, who is starting to understand the value of Jesus. Jesus doesn't necessarily believe that he's a rebellion leader, but Judas thinks that he can help get the Romans out of Israel. Jesus continues to acquire followers and disciples. He heads to Jerusalem, where John the Baptist baptizes him, and people view it as a significant event where there's a deep connection to God. He goes to the desert near Jerusalem, where he's tempted by Satan, but he also receives a vision of how he's destined to save humanity and destined to die on the behalf of humanity, which Jesus kind of supports. He also is torn between preaching love and preaching fire or force, because on one hand, love is necessary to benefit humanity, but also the force is important because there are a lot of people who don't want to do good, like the uber wealthy, and the people who are careless and just don't really care and sin without thinking. And in deciding to fight some of these people, Jesus gains a number of enemies, especially the elder and wealthy Jews in Jerusalem, which Judas notes is going to help fundamentally change the structure of Jewish society. Later, Jesus again foresees his death, and he stops short of telling his disciples. He tells Judas mainly because he deeply trusts him. But then he goes on to tell his disciples, who are a bit sad and are keen on writing down his works, even if Jesus notes that some of those writings aren't 100% true. At the behest of Jesus, Judas goes and tells the Romans and the higher-ups about Jesus' actions, and that gets him sentenced to death and crucified. But in the moment of his crucifixion, a guardian angel shows up and shows him an alternate reality where he actually wasn't crucified. He marries Mary Magdalene, but later she is murdered for her connection to Jesus. And he meets a number of people who are spreading his word, and he's upset because they seem to be mangling what he was trying to say. But they note that this is just all part of the machinery of salvation, and it's out of his control now. And eventually he sees his disciples and even Judas, who are all upset that he left the cross and that he seems to have betrayed the Jewish people as well as Israel as a whole. And this upsets Jesus, and he decides to return to the cross, where he is crucified, and he notes that his work is being done, and that's where the story ends there. In terms of analysis, boy howdy, is there quite a bit to talk about with the last temptation of Christ. It felt like there was it was a line by line kind of thing, and this is 500 pages long. There is so much to decipher with this story. I'm afraid I'm not going to have enough time in this video to really do it 100% justice, and this might require multiple videos sometime down the road. But I do think it's worth pursuing and checking out on your own. Even though I told you a lot in the summary, that's really the vague outline of the book. If you want something in more detail, you're going to have to read this. But one of the themes, one of the ideas that Kazantzakis is working with here is temptation. Of course, that is the name of the story, The Last Temptation of Christ. And what exactly is meant by the last temptation? I really think it's the last time Jesus was tempted by evil, or it could mean the last temptation that Jesus gave into before he started his path of righteousness. I think you could interpret that a number of different ways, but it's clear that Jesus is tempted to evil and sin many times in the story. Like he's tempted to abandon his mission because it's a struggle, because he doesn't feel that he is actually the Messiah at times. And it's a lot of work that he would much rather, I don't know, just go off and marry Mary Magdalene. But he never really gives into that. Like he's headstrong. He has great friends who keep him on the right path. So he never really does that. And you could also argue that the temptation is to give in to blasphemy too. Particularly because he notes that to believe that he is the Messiah goes against the fundamental nature of the Jewish religion. To place yourself as the Son of God, which is something unheard of in the Jewish religion, I believe, that would get you in deep trouble if the rabbi elders knew about it. And Jesus's uncle, the Rabbi Simeon, is willing to keep that quiet initially. But Jesus has to deal with that the sin of knowing that he's being blasphemous for quite some time. And then he's also tempted by sex. Now, whether or not sex is really a temptation or a sin, that's another question entirely contextual, or contingent entirely on what your religion really is and what you see sex as. But he's still tempted by it, especially with Mary Magdalene, because he was tempted to have sex with her, have a relationship with her, marry her, but he always felt the pull of something else. And every time he thinks about Mary Magdalene, he feels an intense pain and intense suffering, because he knows that's temptation, but he also really wants to be with this woman. He loves her, and she loves him, but it can't really work out. You could argue that the ultimate temptation is choosing to leave the cross, because Jesus dying on the cross is the way things are ordained to be. It's the most pure thing imaginable in this religion. But if he leaves the cross, that's a temptation. That's choosing not to save humanity. That's choosing to live another life, a life of potential sin, because in this alternate world, I think he does have sex with Mary Magdalene, and it's a very beautiful moment, but it is still, according to Jesus, 100 pages back, probably a big sin for him, a huge temptation. And although it is tempting to leave the cross, Jesus chooses not to do it. And therein lies what Nikos Kazantzakis is trying to say. He's trying to say that in choosing not to leave the cross, and choosing not to have sex, and choosing to live this pure life, that makes Jesus the ultimate Messiah figure, the ultimate paragon of humanity. Because he has a choice in the matter. He isn't simply this all-powerful, omnipotent human being who only chose a life of good. Now, again, free choice is part of humanity's overall deal in the Christian religion. But this was very controversial at the time, because again, it suggests that sin was an option for Jesus, something that he considered. Ultimately, he decided not to go with it, but there's still that idea that he could have sinned if he chose to do so. And there's a whole bunch of different ideas out there, particularly one that suggests that if sin enters the mind of God and he chooses not to do it, it doesn't leave a spot or anything like that, because sin makes us dirty. And the idea and thinking of sin makes us dirty. But Kazantzakis is saying, if you think about sin but you don't engage in it, you're not dirty. It's just a choice that you could have made, and what matters is the choice itself. But another question I have is does doing sin actually make you less pure? Is it the action that matters most, or is it the person that matters most? Because Jesus was a pure person. He was never going to do anything truly evil. But if he committed one evil action, or committed one sinful behavior, lusting after Mary, wanting to have sex with her, having a consenting relationship with her, would that have made Jesus any less than? According to the Christian religion, probably. But I feel like that's the wrong way to think of things. That's my ultimate problem with the Christian religion and many religions, is arguing that like Jesus was a pure being because he didn't think of sex or anything like that. But we can all follow like Jesus's message, I think. At least that's what Kazantzakis is saying. But it seems like he's trying to say that like you can't engage in sex or other sins. And like the moment you do, that makes you less than, which I don't really think is true. Like, sex isn't that bad. Sex is something that everyone does. Why would that be the thing that prevents Jesus from truly being a Messiah figure, truly being the savior of humanity? I don't quite get it, and I don't quite agree with what Kazantzakis is saying here. Not to say it's a bad message, it's just something I don't agree with his overall point in that regard. Kazantzakis is also talking about the Messiah here, the idea of the Messiah and what it entails for followers and whatnot. Jesus feels immense pressure to be the savior of humanity. It's growing on him over time, and it produces a lot of pain, a lot of struggle for him, because he doesn't really know how to handle things, and sometimes he reacts in great anger and frustration. There's an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this. "It was only when a cross was ordered for a crucifixion that he threw himself body and soul into his work and labored day and night like a madman. He went no longer to the synagogue. He did not want to set foot in Cana again, or to go to any of the festivals. And when the moon was full, his mind reeled, and the unfortunate mother heard him rave and shout in a delirium as though he were quarreling with some devil." And that gives you an idea of what's going on for Jesus. Like he's so frustrated with God that he's creating crucifixes for the Romans to kill all the messiahs that God really wants to proclaim as the rebellion leaders or something like that. And he's sort of yelling and arguing and dealing with a lot of pain. There's an element of mental illness that I'll talk about later, which probably has upset a lot of people at the time. But what's clear is that Jesus is reluctant. The Jews are seeking a revolutionary, and it's hard for him to really engage in that because it entails so much. And Jesus ultimately knows that to do so would mean that you're going to be killed in the end, that your life is going to be sacrificed. But also in the fact that Jews seek a revolutionary, it really seems like anyone will do. At multiple points in the story, many people are questioned as to whether they are the Messiah or not, whether they are the revolutionary figure who can help lead Israel from the Romans. But it does seem like anyone will do. Like, Jesus is there, but it could have been anyone. Like, Jesus is just there. He fits the qualifiers. He fits the description. And so people choose to follow him as a result. And you can see how that might be a controversial message too, because it suggests that, like, Jesus might not have been the Messiah, or that, anyone could have been the Messiah, as long as they were pure and quality human beings. Like, people would have followed them, and in fact, that's exactly what happened at the time. Like, Jesus's rebellion, Jesus's crucifixion was one of many that took place in Israel at the time as they were rebelling against the Romans. This has happened for hundreds of years, and like, every single one of these people were viewed with some light as bringing deliverance to the Jewish people. And that, I'm sure a lot of people did not like the idea that Kazantzakis was suggesting that, like, Jesus wasn't necessarily a unique individual in that way. But even though that Jesus is the Messiah, or might be the Messiah, he still has doubts. Like, it fills him with a lot of confidence, and he feels like he's in a better place emotionally and mentally speaking. But there's still those lingering doubts. He wonders if he's doing things the right way. He has that question of, do I go the way of peace, or do I go the way of fire and drag everyone to this paradise rather than simply inviting them? I don't think Jesus ever really gets out of that doubtful mindset, which is good, because, like, even if you're doing the right thing, even if you're, like, trying to lead people to a better future, you're going to have your doubts. Like, it's not like just being in a better place doesn't necessarily get rid of those mental problems, those mental struggles of your past. And I like that, because Kazantzakis is showing that, everyone has those struggles, even Jesus. Like, Jesus was, after all, a human being, even though people like to call him something more. But yeah, he has those doubts. What's also interesting is in relation to the Messiah, he has his followers, but they also have their own interpretations, their own way of seeing God. And sometimes that's taken out of Jesus' hand. So he kind of witnesses the event of people taking on this religion and turning it into something that maybe he didn't necessarily want, which is unfortunate, of course. But there is an interesting quote that I would like to read to you from this again. "I don't give a hoot about what's true and what's false, or what I saw him or didn't see him, or whether he was crucified or wasn't crucified. I create the truth, created out of obstinacy and longing and faith. I don't struggle to find it, I build it. I build it taller than man, and thus I make man grow. If the world is to be saved, it is necessary, do you hear, absolutely necessary, for you to be crucified, and I shall crucify you like it or not. It is necessary for you to be resurrected, and I shall resurrect you, like it or not. For all I care about you, you can sit here and in your miserable village and manufacture cradles, troughs, and children. If you want to know, I shall compel the air to take your shape. Body, crown of thorns, nails, blood. The whole works is now part of the machinery of salvation. Everything is indispensable." And that is a very fascinating quote near the end of the story. It's part of the alternate life that Jesus envisions for himself rather than dying on the cross. And this is someone who's come up and said, I'm spreading the words of Jesus, and I'm choosing to do so how I want, and in a way that benefits humanity. You could argue that this is probably Satan tempting Jesus, and maybe it is, but I think it's something larger. I think it's Jesus realizing that he no longer controls the message after a certain point, and that this new religion, this new idea is taking a different shape, one that is becoming the machinery of salvation, and just like its own cycle of how the word of Jesus has been spread. It might proclaim more now. It might proclaim something that he never talked about. It could also be representing the church, and how after a certain point, like it was no longer about peace and love towards humanity, but sort of accepting your oppression in life, because after you die, you get to experience paradise. And so you should just accept your lot in life, which is absolutely not what Jesus was saying at that point. But Kazantzakis, in another controversial bit of writing, is saying that, eventually Jesus' own words are being transformed into something he no longer said. And is this really what Christianity is? Are these really the teachings of Jesus? If this religion doesn't match what its creator kind of envisioned. Another really fascinating element of this book is the relationship between Jesus and Judas. At first, and even near the end, it's a very conflicting, confrontational style of relationship. Judas doesn't really like Jesus, because Judas wants a rebellion figure, and Jesus doesn't really want to be that. Even after he becomes the so-claimed Messiah, he still wants to preach love more than he wants to preach the fire, or like what John the Baptist was saying. And Judas is so eager for an Israel that belongs to the Jewish people that he keeps pushing Jesus to say something more, and even threatens to kill Jesus if he doesn't turn out to be exactly what he's claiming to be. It's the idea of love versus fire, of preaching peace versus preaching confrontation and challenging those who oppress humanity at large. And they seem to be great friends over the course of the story. Once they get closer, and at Jesus' behest, Judas betrays him, but it deeply pains him to have to do that, because it hurts the rebellion overall. But also he's betraying a great friend at this point, and you see that especially at the end of the story, where Judas calls Jesus out for not dying on the cross, saying that he's betrayed the people of Israel in the process. But more so than that, he loved Jesus, and Jesus forced him to betray him. Jesus forced Judas to sell him out to the elders and the Roman people, and for him not to die on the cross, that is a sacrifice that Judas had to make that meant nothing. And it's a great moment where Judas is just displaying his entire heart and wondering why Jesus chose that path. And it really gets at the nature of their friendship, and I think it's really great writing on Kazantzakis' part. Probably well worth the price of admission to to this story. There are a number of other great things about this story. There's ominous writing, particularly describing the deserts of Israel, describing Jerusalem at large as a very hostile and unforgiving place, getting at some of the suffering that Jesus is feeling, kind of like the world of Israel is reflected in his mind, which I think is really, really quality writing there. The internal struggle that Jesus is going through is well written, something that I think everyone can kind of relate to. There's the character of Mary Magdalene, very fascinating kind of how she's written and how she basically calls Jesus out for sort of shielding himself from the world by using God and his own frustrations. I wish there was more to the Mary Magdalene character, and also noting how, like, he doesn't say the words mental illness, probably because, he probably didn't have that language at the time, but it does seem like Jesus has a mental illness, like schizophrenia or whatnot, that causes him to hear voices that aren't actually there. And you could offer an explanation that all of this is happening because Jesus is mentally ill, that the Jews found a mentally ill loner and were like, this guy must be the Messiah, and they made him that, and Jesus rose to the occasion. Very controversial message, maybe not exactly what Kazantzakis is saying, but there is room for that kind of argument, I think. There are also a number of problems with this story. At times, it does feel like Kazantzakis is paraphrasing from the Bible and just using a bunch of stories that are in the Bible, and it feels like, given that this is a work of fiction and heavily like moving away from the story of Jesus and the story of the passion and the resurrection, and given that that's the case, he doesn't need to take so much from the Bible. It does feel like I'm reading verse at times, like biblical verse. So I feel like that's a point against this story. And then it also feels repetitive, characters repeating the same thing over and over and over and over, especially the disciples. Given that this is 500 pages, I feel like if you got rid of that repetition, you'd massively cut down on this book, and it would still be a high quality story. And again, related to that, it does go on too long, partially due to the repetition, and it also feels incredibly sexist as well. Many times Kazantzakis says, like, the only thing a woman can do is like they're not destined for heaven. They can only listen to their husband's word. Like, they don't have a connection with God. Only men can have a connection with God. And I don't know if he's making a commentary on the Christian religion there, but it feels like this is something that Kazantzakis actually believes. And he derails the story by stopping to say that every so often. And it just makes the other women characters besides Mary Magdalene feel insignificant in this story, which is weird given that, like, Mary of Nazareth is such a big part of the overall Jesus story. So, yeah, the sexism kind of makes it hard to truly enjoy this story. And then also worth noting is that this is a banned book, and I think you can see why, because it tells the story of Jesus, but it definitely makes a lot of its own sort of additions to the story. Like, Kazantzakis says a lot of things about Jesus that the people in the Greek church, like the Greek Christian Orthodox Church, definitely did not like to hear, suggesting the mental illness, suggesting that Jesus had a choice to commit sin rather than just making him a pure overall being, suggesting that Jesus considered not dying on the cross and living that alternate life. Like, all of that is very controversial. And I can understand why it would be a banned book because of that. Now, everyone has their doubts about religion. Everyone has their doubts about their own faith. And this book is kind of that. Like, it kind of shows that you can have your doubts and you can question your faith while still feeling connected to Jesus and still feeling connected to God. And I feel like that's all the message that a lot of people hear, especially those who are prone to believing in God and whatnot. It's not simply listening to the church or whatnot. And again, like, it also suggests that maybe the church is twisting Jesus's words and not adhering to the original message, and that would anger those in power. Like, just like like it angered the people of Jerusalem. Like, they were upset about what Jesus was teaching, especially the uber wealthy, and they had him killed because of it. Like, I can see that a message like this would also make those in power upset that Kazantzakis is really calling into question how they're using their power and what they're saying about Jesus. So it's very interesting that this is a banned book. Anyway, those are my many thoughts on The Last Temptation of Christ. A high quality book, but it can be a bit of a struggle to get through because of the sexism, because of the biblical nature of the book. And if you don't believe, if you're a strong atheist like me, it might be hard to get through this book because its underlying principle is God is real and Jesus is the Messiah. But I think if you can get past that and see this book for what it is, about a struggle of faith, a struggle to be what oppressed people need you to be, and so much more. Like, I feel like if you can get into that, this is a high quality book that is an absolutely must read in my opinion. So I definitely recommend it to you, although it's probably not for everyone. But yeah, if you have any thoughts on it, or you simply want to say something about my review here, let me know in the comments below. I would love to have a discussion with you about this. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out not only about this book and this author, but other books on this channel too, if they're curious. And yeah, don't forget to join the Discord. So if you want to have a discussion about books as well as movies and many other interesting topics. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and religious travels. Farewell.